Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you for the introduction. Well, we've heard so much today, it's a little bit a hard act to follow. Some compelling stories from Serbia, now from Latvia, from the field. Some of our friends from academia has given us some background of what is conflict. Just one interesting observation is that we're talking about journalism in conflict. We use the word war quite often. There's not really a definition of war. What is a war? Particularly, there's no definition of what is a civil war. In the old days, as we heard, it was interstate wars. It was wars between countries. They declared wars, and then they would, at the end, one of the countries would win, and then the war was over. Today, we're talking about, technically the term is non-international armed conflicts. We call them civil wars, but there's no definition of what constitutes a civil war. Quite interesting. How many people need to die before it's a civil war? 1? 100? 1,000? Well, there are different ways of looking at it. There are different databases that calculate it. But I think the point is that we don't really know it, and we need to think about when we use these terms that these are contested terms. We use them in the public space, and it creates some imagination of what we're talking about. Think about Syria, for instance. It started as a public protests in streets. It was a human rights issue. It was about people not being allowed to express themselves. And at some point over the past 3-4 years, it turned into a full-blown civil war. But at which point? Well, over the years, we've seen the language is changing little by little. But it's not a definition that is straight. I know it's a little bit late in the day. I want to show you a few pictures here of some of the situations that I've been engaged in. They're all from conflict zones. And think about that when you look at them. It's not that many pictures. This is from Syria. This one is from northern Kenya. These are Somali refugees. This one is from inside Somalia. This one is actually from Darfur, which we heard about earlier. This one is from northern Mali. Yes, that's automatic weapons. This is from Yemen. This is from Central African Republic in outside of Bangui, the capital. This is also outside of Bangui. This is the airport area in Bangui where there are approximately 100,000 people gathered around the airport for protection. This is from Myanmar, I think. I remember, Rakhine State. Also conflict. This is from Pakistan. And this is a place that's quite close to my heart, Eastern Congo. Now, all these pictures are from conflict zones, place where you have armed conflict. There's also one other thing they have in common. And that is you haven't seen any weapons on them. You haven't seen any military on them. My point here is that when we talk about conflicts, 90% of the coverage that comes out of conflicts is about what 10% of the people in that place are doing, the combatants. That's 90% of the conflict. That's about the shooting and the warfare itself, the guys with guns. The 90% are these ones, the civilians. And in any conflict, whichever shape or form or intrastate or interstate or whatever, these guys, they always lose. There are absolutely no winners in conflict for the civilian population. So that is what I work with now in humanitarian affairs. And I've tried to, before this conference, when I got the invitation, I was trying to think about what are the things that I know as a journalist, that I have brought into the work that I've done in humanitarian crisis over the years. And I think there are some key skills that are directly transferable that good journalists do, that aid workers also do. I work mostly in communication and reporting for the United Nations in crisis, in Central East Africa and Asia, in Kosovo for a while, and the Middle East. So I've been in many of these crises, and I've seen and I've met the reporters there. And that's an interesting fact, because when you come as an aid worker, you meet those reporters at the same places. Sometimes you meet the same reporters at the same places in the same conflict. Why? Because we're basically going after the same kind of information when we come to a conflict zone. We need to find out things fast. That's the overall thing. You arrive in a country. That's particularly relevant to natural disasters. Well, now we're talking conflict, which are not obviously natural disasters. But you need to find out where you are, what's going on, who's doing what and why. You need to find that out very, very fast. We heard it earlier from some of the other speakers about how you really need to prepare yourself. Well, you can do only so much in preparation, because there's nothing like being there yourself. You can read and read and read, and you can get briefings and from people who've just come out of the country, and you sit down and da-da-da-da-da. You get it all, but you'll learn much more by being in the country for 1 hour. That's my experience, simply by being there. Now, when we get into a conflict zone, and that is, that is something that both aid workers and journalists will do, we will seek out particular points in a city, for instance, where we know that there are information to get. It can be hospitals, it can be schools, it can be public buildings, it can be places where you have concentration of people. Normally in conflicts you have huge amounts of people who are displaced from their homes. You seek out these places where you know that there's information to get. You'll seek out local media, if there's local media. Local journalists, they're some of the best sources you can get. They know what's going on, and they know who else knows, right? So you try to get a handle on how many people are here. Who are these people? What kind of language do they speak? What kind of, I need, if I'm a journalist, I need a fixer who speaks that language. Very often, if it's these internal conflicts, you need a fixer who can speak both of the languages, because very often there are two groups of people that speak different languages. So you need somebody who can manage both. So we're chasing very much after the same kind of information. Now, we do it for slightly different reasons. Well, we both want to establish the facts as we see them. The journalist wants to establish them because she or he needs to tell a story. And they're under immense pressure, the journalists. I work quite a lot with television. It's enormously expensive to have television crews in crisis areas. Just the insurance of it is very, very expensive. So they are supposed to file the first report within the first couple of hours that they have landed. That's why in these crises you see the first report is in front of the airport, because the editor at home, you need to start filing now. For us as aid workers, it's the same thing. When we are out there trying to assess the situation, we also have bosses back home who want information. The journalists will do it because that's what they do. They report the news. It's a long discussion about what is news and why do we tell the news. Well, I'm sure it's a very long debate. For me, it's simple as that. Journalists report the news because there are news to report. And that's it. That's enough for me. For an aid worker, we go a step further because we gather information not particularly with the intention to publish it to a mass audience, but to publish it to a particular kind of people who can activate a response to what is going on. So we gather very specific information on the population. Is it mainly a population of grown-up men who seem to be healthy? Is it mainly a population of women and children? How's their nutritional status? Do they seem, are they traumatized? Are they kind of hiding? Are they scattered around? Or do they group? Or do they sing together? All these kind of little things that you can observe on the ground that give the experienced aid worker an idea of what is needed here. Is it food? Is it water? Is it shelter? Is it psychosocial support? Is it simple protection of these people? And we need to report that back so that our aid organizations, be it the United Nations in my case, can mobilize a response to those needs to help those people. But as I said, essentially the information gathering, the news gathering as a journalist would call them, we would call it disaster assessment. It's the same process. I need this little aide-memoire for myself. I help you, you help me. Together we help them, is my second point. That is about how we work together as journalists and aid workers in the field. I've kind of seen it from both sides. As a journalist, I would, one of the things that I did was back in 2003, I think I went to northern Uganda to cover the war, it looked like, of the Lord's Resistance Army, who was ravaging northern Uganda at the time. It was absolutely horrible. And I got embedded with the Ugandan People Defense Force, it's called. So I was traveling with them when they were chasing Lord's Resistance Army folks in the bush. And that was very dramatic, and I got some good stories, and I was with the photographer, and everything went well. But I quickly realized that what we were doing was we were exactly reporting the 10%. And we were not reporting the 90%. I just had to turn around, and I could see these huge camps of internally displaced people, people who have been driven from their homes, living in mud huts on really on the barest minimum you can imagine. And that was the story. That was the story. When I wanted to cover that story, well, the military couldn't help me. The aid organizations could help me. So they are there, and they were there. They're still there today. They're doing something different today, but they were there. And I hooked up with them, and we got in touch, and we, I got the information from them, and they took me to the camps, and they introduced me to the right people, and we got what we came for. That was as a journalist. When I work as an aid worker, I also use or collaborate with the media. Sometimes because the media, they come before we do. They're there before I come. I have no clue what's going on. Very often I'll ask, okay, who are the reporters around here? I need to go out and invite them for dinner. They always come when I invite them for dinner. And then I'll pick their brains, because they're usually very well informed. And they have the information, exactly the same information that I need in order to be able to function in that particular place. So I use them, they use me. I also use them for something else. And they use me. We all use each other. Because they need to get to the story, and sometimes I have access to areas where that story is. It's not my job to tell them what the story should be or nothing, but I have access to the area where I know the story is, and then I just need to get them in there, and then they'll tell their own story. I do that with several things in mind. I know the journalists, they're there very often. They see themselves as objective reporting the situation. They're not supposed to intervene in the situation. They're just there to tell the outside world that something horrible is going on. And when that's done, the send button is pressed, the job is done. That's kind of the general attitude. I know there are exceptions, but that's a general attitude. That's, as an aid worker, no, that's not my job only. We need to make sure that what goes out in the public sphere has some kind of reaction, that it triggers some kind of response from that world that we are informing. Typically, it is about, obviously, first of all, raise awareness that this is happening. That's one thing. Secondly, it is to alert to the international donor community that something is going on here. We are able to respond to it, but it will cost a lot of money. So we need you to help us with the money, because we don't have any money. We need to raise the money as we respond to crisis at the same time. Thirdly, we often try, when we work with the media, to send some kind of political signal. Very often in crisis, particularly internal conflicts, there's an issue of access into the country. We can send a message to the neighboring states through the mass media that we need access. They need to help us to access that country. We also, it's also frequently on my mind when I speak to mass media about crisis that in many crises there are not enough aid organizations to respond. And we need to send a message to the hundreds of organizations that we have around the world that here is a crisis where their intervention is needed. And there's no better way than doing it through the mass media. And you will hear me, perhaps, or somebody else from the UN, Humanitarian world, giving interviews on television saying, yeah, it's horrible and we are doing all we can, but we really need more aid workers to come and help us. That's a simple message that we can diffuse through the mass media. It's not a hidden, we're not trying to trick or spin or anything. But it's a message because we communicate with a purpose. We don't just communicate for communication's sake. We do it for a purpose. So working with journalists about humanitarian crisis and particularly conflict, I also have personal opinions of what I think is good journalism and less good journalism, and what journalists I personally think are good journalists. And those are the journalists who stick with the story. Not the journalists who come in, as we just discussed, I think, in the break, who parachute in, somehow run over the border, whatever they do, get some kind of story, and run out again, publish that story, and then they run off to somewhere else. Because now they have done Afghanistan, they've done Somalia, they've done whatever, Congo, whatever. They've been there once, they've written 1 or 2 stories, and then they're out. Well, that's all fair enough. I've done that myself. But the ones that I really respect are those who get involved and stick with the story. Those who come back. Also after the fighting has stopped. The peace agreement is there. Things are calming down. Maybe there's some peacekeeping operation going on. And it's not top news. It's not above the fold anymore. But they come back because they follow the story of the 90% whose lives have been shattered, destroyed, and who need to rebuild their lives. And that's a long story. And it's not told in one article or 6 minutes. So they come back. And I have journalists who've covered, crisis for 6, 7 years. And they come back each time. Sometimes they need a little, okay, now it's a year ago since I wrote last time. Let me go back again. And I can write a story. Since I was here a year ago, this and this has happened. It's a little journalistic trick you can use 3 months after, 6 months after, all these kind of things, which doesn't really make sense because it's not news that it's just 3 months after. But it's a way to trigger the mechanism in the editor's brain that says, oh, that sounds good. So those are the journalists that I think have great ethics, who we talked about being detached or attached to the story, who still maintain their journalistic objectivity, if we can still talk about that, but at least some resemblance of objectivity, but they're attached to the story. It doesn't mean that they get personal, it doesn't mean that they get biased, it doesn't mean that they start romanticizing what is going on, but it means that they actually feel for what they're doing, and they feel for the people that they're writing about. And that is something I have enormous respect for. I would, instead of talking more, I would rather have, if you have some questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Does anybody have any questions for Jens? No? Okay.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. Can I ask you a little bit about your work as an aid worker? When you give access to journalists, is there a chance that this will be seen as a political act and you jeopardize the access that you have as an aid worker? I'm saying that because I have friends that they are working for NGOs and they're always very careful not to be political because they're afraid that they will lose access in certain cases.
Of course, when you work in humanitarian affairs, you need to subscribe to the fundamental principles of humanitarian aid, which is that you need to be neutral, you need to be impartial, you need to be independent, and you need to have humanity. Humanity is the motivating factor for us going in, but we don't have an opinion about who started the war, who's winning it, who's right, who's wrong. No. We don't have an opinion about that, because if we start having opinions about that, that closes access, either to one side or to the other. And a lot of our work, and a lot of the work that I do in trying to manage how this whole thing is perceived, that we are in a conflict, is exactly that. Whenever aid is given to one side, the other side will say, well, you're on their side. And then we go to that side, and then they say, well, you're on their side now. Right? It's trying to manage that and maintain a neutrality and impartiality. Now, helping journalists get access. Well, I would never help a journalist get access if that would jeopardize access for humanitarian organizations, ever. First of all, I think it's the journalist's own responsibility to get access, and they're very good at it. They're actually much better than we are, in many cases. Also because they don't travel with as much machinery, if you like, as we do. So that's the first thing I would never do if it jeopardizes the aid operation. But I would help a journalist with whom I trust to get on, for instance, help them facilitate access to a certain camp that they can't get to otherwise, to travel on a particular aid convoy to a place that they couldn't otherwise go to. Because, well, we are public organizations as well. And we also have an obligation to inform the public about what we do. I don't know if that answers your question.
We have another question.
Hi, keeping with the topic of keeping track of the stories, for you, what could be the advantages of a correspondent that is all the time in a country, covering the stories of that country, and a special deliverer that goes to one place only for a time? Like, does a special deliverer has any advantage within the correspondence?
Yes, of course, they have an advantage. I mean, and we have talked about that there are less and less correspondents in the world. There's less and less money to keep a network of correspondents going, unfortunately. And it's not, I hope I didn't give the impression that I'm kind of bashing those journalists who go in and out. Very often that's simply, that's what's feasible. Like we need to get visas to the country. Aid workers journalists need to get visas to a country. And very often you'll see in countries of conflict, you'll get a visa for 1 week. Right? So you need to do it. You only have a certain period of time to do your story while you're there. So there are certain practical issues why it is done like this. I think what I'm trying to advocate is that once you get involved in these kind of stories, which are profoundly human and profoundly painful for other people, and you start writing about their life, that gives you some kind of responsibility, not just to touch them and drop them, but to actually stick to the story.
You have one more question? Yeah.
I wondered what your views were on these new figures who are part aid workers, part journalists, and part-time film stars. In other words, the celebrities who become, in some ways, it seems to be sometimes the focus of the story, sometimes the people who bring attention to it, but also become part of a kind of the celebrity journalism cult that is following them. Do they promote your work, or do they actually in some ways sabotage it?
Good question. Well, they do help, because otherwise we wouldn't do it. They do help our work because they do have access to, how can I say, means or channels of visibility that we don't have otherwise. They are very good at raising money, honestly. They're very good at raising money. And some of those who are film stars and then part-time aid workers as well, they even, they go to and they brief the Foreign Affairs Committee of the American Congress, for crying out loud. I mean, so if we can, equip them with the information that we really need the American, Congress to know, well, then we can use them as a channel. So, yes, I wouldn't shy away from using them. However, I have also, listened to the debates, and I have experienced in the field people where I think, no, this is simply inappropriate, because it actually appears that they are more concerned about their own career than with helping the people that they are purporting to help.
Okay, thank you very much. If you have more questions, you can find Jens after.